All right, everybody, this is First Draft Friday. I am your host, Alessandra Torrey, and today we are joined by Jim Woods, and we are going to be talking all about creating a structure for your story and what that process looks like and what that process means. So I am excited. As you guys know, I am coming to you from Authors AI. We have an artificial intelligence that helps you improve your novel and find ways to make it better. So if you haven't checked us out, please visit authors.ai, www.authors.ai. So let's dive right in. Jim, you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I'm Jim Woods. I'm a writer. I've been doing this full time for the last 7 years. Actually just finished up my first novel. I'm in the proof stage here. It's called Bite the Bullet. So I have this like almost legit copy of my book. I've co-written a few books and I've worked with other authors. I love being a writing coach and just, helping writers finish their book. That's one of my real passions. That's a little bit about me.
Across multiple genres, or do you mostly stick to a certain genre?
A lot of self-help productivity because I need it. But I've worked in a lot of different genres as well as health, productivity, health, all that's so combined together. But yeah, I really, any good story, that's where I'm going. And with even like the nonfiction stuff, that's helping me create better stories. So you'll hear me say story so many times. That's my real passion.
Yeah, I love that. And it is great. The best nonfiction tell stories. I mean, that's the few that I've been able to really get through and love, because I'm horrible about setting down a book. Now, our audience is almost all fiction, but I'll be curious to see what you have to share with us today. So tell us what you're going to be talking about. You're going to be talking about story structure. What does that mean? And when will they go through what we're talking about?
Yeah, story structure is really just building your story. And I don't have like super clear definitions for everything. I don't think that's fair to do that. But just I'm going to pretend I'm talking to a coaching client, really. That's what I'm doing. Each of you, even though you're not here with me. So let's just start at the very beginning, like the very, very beginning. Okay, you're saying, hey, I want to write a book. Okay, what next, right? We've all been there. And I'm sure a lot of you, just like me, you start writing a book and you're like, nah, I don't like this. I'm going to do something else. This other thing, I just thought I have a new idea. It's exciting.
Idea over here.
Right? Right?
Yeah.
And I think we all are in that boat. We're all together as creators in that. So let's just say, okay, where you're at the very, very beginning stages. I think that great questions are what fuel great stories. So a few questions that come to mind immediately for me are, what if? What if a killer shark was on the loose? Jaws, hello. What if we had a soap opera in space? I mean, that is literally what George Lucas was thinking. And then, he combined in some Joseph Campbell, obviously, with Hero's Journey. But when you start asking, like, well, what if? I feel like that's like, opening the magical box, and then you can start really like getting somewhere. You can just start playing and exploring in that stage. And one that's always inspired me is like, what's a book you really want to read? I remember even my own novel, Bite the Bullet. I was wandering around the bookstore and I couldn't find a book that I really wanted to read. I was like, I don't see it. I better write it, Yeah. And I think that the questions are so key. Maybe it's what upsets you, what really gets you excited, what's something you love, maybe even what's something you hate. I think to a degree, but then you can spin that more positive and pull it more toward the love side, because nobody wants to read a rant per se in book form. But
there are things we love to hate, right? Like, yeah, like I love a really bad villain, but one that I'm rooting for. Like, I hate to root for the villain, and I hate to be torn between the two, but that's what makes the book great, Yeah,
and I think like when you said that, I think immediately like Walter White in Breaking Bad, where it's like you're cheering for this really, really awful guy. And what's that say about the writers when they have you cheering for this really terrible character, and you're like, oh, it's okay, he killed a bad guy, he was worse than this guy, and I just feel like questions are the story seed. Like you start asking the right questions, that idea in your head can start to just blossom, and before you know it, you're building that book. I do think that it's so easy to fall into the trap of saying, hey, you must write a book this way. And I think you really have to play to your strengths. And if you're a new writer, say you're writing a novel and you're like, never done this before, I don't know what my strengths are. I get it. I do. But I think you can still like lean back on past projects and say, ooh, what did I do that worked really well here? And it doesn't have to be a writing project, but when you like start figuring out, okay, I'm really good at maybe short pieces. Writing a novel sounds a little counterintuitive. It's like, what? Well, I fall into that boat. Frankly, I'm a minimalist. It's like writing a novel. Well, maybe you should write short stories. And that could be like, oh, what if I take some short stories and weave them together and, it becomes a novel.
Layer punch in.
Yeah. And I'll tell you one thing I've learned over the years is like your favorite books, there's almost always so much you can learn in your favorite books. So just like in that exploratory phase of, okay, I'm writing a novel or a nonfiction or whatever you're writing, it's a book. Go through your bookshelves and start picking apart. Like if you can narrow down the genre, that will help you a ton. But even if you don't know, like start exploring your bookshelves and start like, well, why do I like this book? How is that book structured? And I think we can learn so much from that. It's like all the books that you're picking up have like, that kind of antagonist as the main character, the Walter White or, some gritty villain, really. That's probably what you're going to want to do in your novel. I mean, you're not going to write, The Wizard of Oz if your favorite books are all darker and grittier.
Well, what speaks to us as a reader is often what we will create as a writer. Yeah,
absolutely. And look at those books for structure. Don't try to like reinvent the wheel and just start with a blank page, but just get a little like a feel for, okay, well, they're opening up here in this, like the first chapter, it's opening up here. And like break it down a little bit, like figure out, okay, well, what's the beginning, middle, and end for that chapter and even for the book? Because I think that the beginning, middle, and end concept is so important and so powerful versus the, hey, I must follow this specific structure. And I'm not bashing all of the many structures. It's just, it's overwhelming. I've tried them all. Heck, I have a stack of books here. I'll show you and I'll go through them with you. If you're like, everyone wants to say, well, you got to do it this way. I'm like, no, you got to play to your strengths and kind of follow your gut and your heart and look at the books you love, because that's where your like roadmap is for your structure, for your novel, for any book, really. It's like you have all these hints. It's your job to be the detective and to find those little clues and say, okay, all right, here's a clue. All right, let's put that down. And it's more like building a puzzle, frankly. Once you find those corner pieces, though, that's huge. Like if you have an idea already in your head for the ending, holy moly, right? If you don't have an idea for the ending, that's cool too, because a lot of people, that's not their thing. It's like, I don't know. And that's cool too. There's no right or wrong way. At some point, you probably will outline. I think the question is when. Maybe it's
how in depth will
and how. Absolutely. Maybe it's outline after you've already written the book. Maybe you're like, hey, I wrote this book, but I know it's not working. And I feel like a lot of people that do NaNoWriMo, myself included, especially those first few times, it's like, I have no clue what I'm doing. Well, you have this messy, out of order, kind of incoherent, rough draft. And it's like, what's next?
What do I do now? Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, especially if you consider yourself a pantser where you're just kind of writing without a idea in place or a specific order of events, I think that's when you're kind of probably going to look at it and say, okay, well, let's write a summary. What do I have each chapter, each beat? And then you can start to really sort it out. But I know there's some people who they can write like a 20, 30 page outline. As long as that's your strength and you enjoy doing that, or if you find that to be a part of your process, that's cool. But I think a lot of people aren't sure, right?
They aren't, and then they read something that says you have to outline, right? Like, or the only way to really finish your book is to outline. And the one kiss of death is forcing yourself to do something that's against your like creative, flow. Right. And for me, outlining is majorly against my creative flow. Like I get tangled into knots and I can't write a thing because I'm already bored with my story because I know everything that's going to happen. So I think every author is different. And I'm seeing some comments. Angela said that that's where she is. She has a messy first draft that needs the chapters and beats into an outline. And I love that. I do that all the time when I'm done because my first drafts look like they're just like a dumpster fire. Yeah. And going through and outlining and seeing what you have, then you're like, oh, I dragged way too long in this portion. And I rushed through this, and why do I have 5 scenes from so-and-so's point of view, and then I don't see them again until the last scene of the book. So
Angela, again, my heart goes with you. I totally get it. And I've been there. And I think so much of this is figuring out, again, what works for you. I love note cards. I have one of those science fair boards, the cardboard. And I literally wrote out, it's right next to I can grab it, but all the note cards will probably fall off now. But just writing like 2 sentences or 2 words, whatever it means to you. Mm-hmm. Hey, this is my first scene. I went by scenes. I didn't break it into chapters. I had no clue with chapters when I was in that messy, what is this stage? I was just going, okay, this happens. Like very, and just jot it down. I personally even say, get a Sharpie just to make it not precious. You can't get I have some of those big markers, like really obnoxiously large ones. I don't want to get it all like, well, this and this and this. And you don't want to fall into the rabbit hole of your story on these note cards and just start to lay it out again like a puzzle. I love that analogy because I think it's fair if you're in that first draft messy stage that and also just keep in mind some of this could go, some of it it's like it might feel like you're not making progress. I mean, it feels kind of crummy to be like, I have to rewrite this or this character. That's called, it's fiction, and you're going to have a lot of that. But what encourages me with that even is, hey, it could be a short story. Don't assume you're scrapping anything, and one idea will lead to another idea. There's a creative momentum there.
I love that. Valerie said, I'm not a pantser, I'm a card flake. Somewhere between index cards and the snowflake. I love that. And guys, please shout out questions as you go. We did have a question from Angela. I don't know the answer to this. I don't see if you do, but she said, what are the necessary beats in a chapter? I'd love to know that.
I'm not sure, frankly, how to really truly answer that because I think it so much depends on your genre. It depends on your story. It's not like every single chapter is going to look the same. Yeah. However, got to have the conflict. Without conflict, got no story. And I would say too, if you can try to just say, hey, let's set this aside and just pull that one chapter out. Does it make sense? Is there like a beginning, a middle, and end? Is there like the conflict being resolved? Mm-hmm. Or not? It's cool if it's not, that's cool, but you have to leave them hanging, and you have to like leave that reader wanting more to turn the page. I can't truly 100% answer that in a great way because, again, some people might want a 1-page chapter. I'm not going to judge that. If you want to write a 1-page chapter, okay. If you want to write a 20-page chapter, there are 20 pages in there. It's up to you. But I think the key is really having that conflict, making sure that reader's going, hey, I know what's going on within reason. That is clear enough to keep them turning the page. I think that's the real key here. And, if it's, I've had breaks in chapters. I mean, you can totally do that too, where you're kind of like, hey, okay, break.
Time break, yeah.
Yeah, like this is later in the day, or, like you can totally do that too. And I would say too, look at those books you absolutely love. Stay within your genre, if at all possible, because that's the expectations of the reader. Play to the genre, because if it's like a romance novel, it's going to look really different than a crime novel. I mean, it's not even, the conflict is there and the tension and the stakes, but you really need to play to those, that genre specifically.
And I would say, Angela, the only, I think, necessary thing that needs to be in a chapter is a purpose, right? Like it needs to have a purpose. And it is hard because it's almost like, what are the necessary beats in a scene, right? Because a chapter could be a collection of scenes. It could just be a single scene. I have had books with 150 chapters. I've had books with 20 chapters, just depending on whether I've had really long chapters or shorter. James Patterson has very short chapters and, moves through. So like Jim said, and another thing you said early on, and that I wanted to comment on, is you talked about almost like opening a book that you've read and kind of doing like an outline, for lack of a better term, of that book.
Yeah.
And when I looked at writing screenplays years ago, the first thing my screenplay coach said was, sit down and watch an episode of whatever you're planning on writing. If you're planning on writing a drama, then sit down and watch the pilot episode of Breaking Bad and outline it and see, did they spend 2 minutes on each scene before they, time each scene, see how long it is, and outline that so you can understand how a script is written and how it should be laid out. And it's going to be very formulaic in terms of, there are genre expectations. I mean, he didn't use that word, but I'm translating it into novel talk.
For sure.
The scenes typically in your genre will be certain amount of links. There'll be certain amount of description and dialogue, and really analyzing, almost like a forensic analysis.
Yes.
You don't have to do the entire book, but of the first 3 chapters will really help you understand kind of how popular books in those genres, current popular books in those genres are written.
I couldn't agree more. And on the movies, TV, turn on the subtitles. It will make your dialogue so much better.
Oh, I like that too.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, like that's a game changer, especially for fiction with dialogue, because so much dialogue is on the nose or over explaining. Yeah. And if just turn on the subtitles, like once you do that, that'll change your approach with dialogue. I think that you really just have to experiment with different approaches too. And setting some boundaries, setting some parameters. Always the real main template is that beginning, middle, and end. I do prefer the 4-act, structure, because I think the midpoint is huge. That was a game changer for me, because then the midpoint is essentially cutting the story in 2. It's that big of a deal. And that's more of a screenwriting trick, I think, for the most part, because if you watch any movie, the midpoint, it's like, okay, and this is before the big change. And then it's, setting up the rest of the middle, and then you have the end. And I think the midpoint really is key. If you're struggling, if you're like, your story's kind of meandering a bit, I think the midpoint can totally solve that problem. In my book, I mean, literally, that's how I finished it. Without that 4-act structure. Okay, basically, beginning, act 1, middle is cut into 2, so it's like 2A, midpoint where everything changes, and then 2B is the wrap up of the 2nd act, and then the 3rd act is the end. So the middle is just, I mean, we can have a messy middle sometimes if you're not sure the story's meandering. That's where that midpoint is so huge. And this is not the greatest example in the world. It is a movie, but like Christmas with the Cranks is one of those cheesy 90s Christmas movies. And like, you can find the midpoint where it's like, oh, well, the daughter's going to come home and surprise the the parents. Like, it's such a game changer that it just drives the rest of the story. And some stories, the midpoint might be subtle. It might not be that big a deal. It might be a little more just a false victory. But I think, I mean, it's up to you and how you really want to shape it. And that's one thing I think just setting up a midpoint is like, that's like, it's almost as important as that finding that ending. And if you're not sure, aim for the midpoint, because
So
that
by
will establish it.
midpoint, are you talking about like if you see a normal story arc, right? And you have like the climax at the top. So where is the midpoint? Is it a swell of activity or excitement before the climax?
I know what you mean with the swell.
Yeah.
I would say literally aim at the middle, smack in the middle. And you have flexibility as a novelist. Like my midpoint doesn't fall smack like 100% in the middle, but it's within that, 10, 20 pages right in there. And when you see it, you're gonna be like, oh, well, shoot, everything changed. Yeah. And I think it adds to the story when you're really like stepping on the gas pedal versus, you ever read a book and you're just kind of like, where's this going?
Just wandering.
Where's this really going?
So if I understand correctly, you're saying there needs to be ideally like a pivotal moment in the middle of the book, or a introduction of new conflict, or so that's something that changes the course of the story around the middle of the book. That's
what I'm saying. Yeah. And it's in some books, it's not as big of a deal. In some genres, like action is going to be way more evident. But it's there if you look for it, if you really start analyzing and you say, oh, well, you know what? In this specific story, there was a false victory. Like, I'm trying to remember in Jaws, but I know there was a false victory. I think it was literally they found
caught a shark,
the tiger shark. Yeah,
it wasn't a shark. Yeah,
and it wasn't right. Mm-hmm. And that's a good example where it's like right before they like Act 3, the final ending, climax. It's obvious it's coming because that big final confrontation. It's been building toward it all along. I know what you're thinking with the arc where it's going up and up and up. I feel like I'm looking at it a little bit more like a roller coaster where you're going to have different hills.
Yeah. And that's my ideal arc goes like this.
Yeah.
And for a lot of you who write romance, that middle point would be typically when they break up.
Exactly. Rom-coms too.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that was a game changer for me. And I'll be honest, you have to do your homework on this. You have to do your due diligence on midpoints. In some movies, it's not as big a deal. In some books, it's not as big a deal. But for me, it was a total game changer because I could literally say in my book, okay, up until this point, this is what's happening in the story. But when this one thing changes, when there's like this big assassination attempt where nobody saw it coming, well, all right, now the stakes are even higher. And that is a personal preference too, where I think some people they really want the conflict. They really want the stakes. And that's one thing I'll fully admit. I don't want to mess around. I want people to die. I want things to change. I don't want the ending to just be like, and it was a dream, I want something to happen where I think sometimes it's like, and this was a big fake out, I've seen those and they always kind of let me down. Personally, and that's a personal taste thing. I'm not knocking everything in these genres. It's just a personal taste.
Dream. They wake up from a dream at the end. I think everybody does a groan. Yeah.
Right. It can be done well. I like, but I think at that point, it's the whole story is not hinging on that ending. With that, I've seen a few times where in stories it's done well, but it's kind of a reveal. It's not really the whole story was hinging on that. It's not as long as you're meeting those expectations. And also another thing for Angela and everyone in this kind of stage, keep in mind too, with setups and payoffs, like literally that's the easy way to outline. Hey, I set up this. Is there a payoff? Just listing those out. That's a huge thing.
Let's dive into that a little bit more for someone who doesn't know what that means. So what do you mean by a setup? How many steps should you have in your book?
If you introduce a character, they're going to have to do something, right? That's one of our common mistakes. If you're like, hey, I forgot about that character, or somehow I changed their name. But if you're setting something up, if you're setting up some form of conflict, say it's an employee and they're having tension with their boss, he's either going to have to quit or get fired or something like that. Like, you're setting it up. You're setting up expectations, and you're also giving those actions some consequences. If you...
So is it like the introduction of a conflict?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, anything you're setting up in a story, if you show a character, if a character says something, there again needs to be a purpose, kind of like you mentioned there. And it also, like, there needs to be a reason,
Yeah.
There needs to be some causation too.
Okay, so you're literally setting up something that
you are
and later in the book.
Yeah.
And then you need to have, I think you said, the resolution. Is that what you called it?
Some form of resolution, like some form of payoff. I'm so better with movies than I am with books, but for example,
people have watched the movies typically, so they always make good examples.
But it's part of this is to Chekhov's gun. If you show a gun in one scene, they have to use it. Mm-hmm. And in so many cases, I think we, as writers, we have lots of ideas, but then we kind of get wrapped up in more ideas. So if you go through your scenes and you say, like, I'm looking over at my board here. Okay, I have a U-Haul incident that, it was a car dealer had a U-Haul, like, dealership, and I set up like he was going to give some leads and some information that would help the main characters. But then I kind of left him hanging.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, well, the cartel could be after him. Maybe he's a plant. Maybe they're tapped his phone. I didn't go anywhere with it. I just kind of like, oh, and this scene's here. It's by itself. I didn't really have a payoff for it. Mm-hmm. Later, I was like, oh, I got to fix this. I had set up something. There was some conflict with this character, Marty. What happened to Marty? I don't know. We set it up. And I even, like, had the character give him his business card. I was like, okay, we set all this up. What's the payoff? Well, my payoff at the end was, like, it was a little bit ambiguous, but it added to the tension. I was like, the character calls Marty and Marty's not answering the phone. Mm-hmm. I was kind of hinting at, like, hey, his phone was disconnected. Maybe the cartel got him. It wasn't completely crystal clear with that payoff, but I was like, I don't care. I'm not going to go back just to have them find his body. It doesn't really matter in the story, but I wanted to still, tie that bow and to help raise the stakes of the story. And that was just one example where I'm like, it's so easy to overlook that setups must have some form of payoff. I know that's not like the most elaborate explanation.
No, I love that. And I think new pantsers really struggle with this because we don't know where our story's going to go. We don't know how we're going to use characters. And we're like, oh, this is fun. And then we forget about that person. And then you read a review a year later that's like, whatever happened to the little old lady at the store? Yeah. Like, did she ever find her happy ending or whatever, happy ever after? And but what about in like a mystery where you're setting up like red herrings? Do you need to tie up those loose ends?
Within reason. Okay. It doesn't necessarily have to be a great explanation because people are smart and they can use their imagination. And I think sometimes it's fun to leave it a little bit open-ended, just a little, because then people come up with theories. As long as it's plausible enough that people aren't like,
as long as you're not deceiving them, right? Yeah. Going down this long rabbit hole with the character, and then you give some dumb explanation for why.
And also in your character development, if a character is really freaking smart, the audience is going to accept that too. They'll be like, oh, well, he thought of this and he just set it up. We're not questioning Hannibal Lecter. He could totally do things, right? And we're like, we're not going to nitpick and be like, well, I don't know if he could escape out of the country after doing. No, you saw him eat a guy. So
how did he get on a private jet? Yeah. Like, does he have airport clearance? Yeah. How did he convince the guy to come to dinner?
Exactly. Right.
I love that example. I use that movie all the time for literary examples, because everybody's seen it, and if you haven't, you should watch Silence of the Lambs.
And that's just, even with that example, it's like he's not even in the movie that much. very little, but has such tremendous impact. And it just tells you how powerful a story can be when you craft great characters, when you have high stakes of like life or death versus, it was all a dream or everybody comes back to life and, all those things
and
that kind of
movie where everyone dies at the end and you're like, well, we know something's going to happen because you can't kill everybody. So, we are out of time. I did want to point out something. If anyone has any last questions, now is your time to shout them out before we go. I did want to point out what I thought was a great tip, and I never do this, and I should, from Camilla. She said watching the director's cut, and I can see why that would be very helpful because they could explain why they chose to film this scene this way or end it here. So I love that tip, and I'm going to start going back and trying to watch director's cuts of my favorite movies.
Yeah. Podcasts and YouTube are amazing with this too, because authors will tell you. Most authors, they're blunt. They're like, oh yeah, I read this book and these helped me shape this book.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, hello, Easter eggs. I just need to pick up these two and kind of analyze those.
I see it. And Marlon, he talked about the W plot structure, which I just learned about like 2 years ago. And that's where, the character starts off at a high point, has a huge problem, solves it, loses everything, and then has to get up the thing. And that's a very common plot structure in romance also. That was where I actually first learned about it. But thank you so much. Thank you guys, everyone who tuned in live. If you are watching us on YouTube or on Facebook, or if you're listening to a replay on the podcast, it's great to have you. Please subscribe to the channel or join the group, and we will see you guys in 2 weeks at our next First Draft Friday. So thank you so much, Jim. If they want to get a hold of you, if they're interested in using you as a writing coach or reading your books, where's the best place to find you?
Just my website, jimwoodswrites.com. That'd be great. I'd love to hear from any writers. Any way I can encourage you. I know we're all in this together. Writers are also readers. And any way we can all put more stories into the world. I love that. So thanks so much for having me.
Also has a podcast. Is your podcast links on that website?
No, but they will be.
They will be. All right. So if you're interested in hearing more from Jim, feel free to check his website in a couple weeks. So thank you guys. Thank you all for joining us. And I hope you guys have a great weekend. Happy Friday.